All right. So what we'll do is we'll jump into the readings. I'll start by kind of articulating what I found of interest. Again, we could use what I found of interest for your fishbowl, or you could just talk about whatever you found of interest. We'll jump through that, and then we'll jump into our fishbowl. So one of the themes that was prevalent throughout this chapter was this idea or this notion of realism. Think about the film that we watched last week, right? The Battle of Algiers. That is a film that uses realism as a method. So the reading really directly ties into what we watched last week. So one of the things that I found important while they're articulating around realism, it says the camera and literature, by extension, while they attempt to try to capture the real, what they really end up capturing is the ideological surroundings of the world that they seek to depict, right? So it's not so the quotidian or the daily activities of who they seek to capture, but it's more so the ideologies and the structures of those individuals. And then, within that, you have to ask, who is this art or who is this work being produced for? And with that question kind of centers how that production will manifest, right? Also, I found this interesting, the idea or this notion of double consciousness as it pertains to representation and how people view the representation. And they use the example of Amos and Andy, right? Whereas this is a very tropish depiction of Blackness. And all those who were observing these depictions, they knew that they were tropes, but they were able to view it from a standpoint of entertainment. And this is where this notion of double consciousness comes in, where is anybody, if I say double consciousness, do you guys have a working understanding of what double consciousness is? Is somebody need me to understand a little bit or clarify a little bit further what double consciousness is?
Can you explain further?
Say what you do, Tori?
Oh yeah, I just do you think you could explain what double consciousness?
So W.E.B. Du Bois in the book The Souls of Black Folks, he kind of coined the term double consciousness. And really where that plays out is the psychological affect of knowing how the dominant world views you. So in The Souls of Black Folks, it plays out in black and white, right? So knowing how the white world views the Black body, right? And then having to sometimes view yourself from that lens, but then also having the consciousness of knowing how the Black world views Blackness. So it's the two warring ideals that come into play of the Black understanding of Blackness and then the dominant culture's understanding of Blackness, and those existing in one body, right? So that's where you get the double consciousness at play. And the way that the author articulates that is there's a double consciousness at play when Black viewers viewed shows like Amos and Andy's, who have this real tropist and coonish stereotypical depiction of Blackness, they're able to compartmentalize that and view it as entertainment and view it from that space of double consciousness, and know the other side of them knows that this is a false misrepresentation of what Blackness is. So that's how double consciousness comes into play. And then he mentions this idea of the mark of the plural, right? And its ability to flatten cultures and to project all colonized people the same, right? And they talk about how whether you were a Seminole Indian, whatever type of Indian, they just depicted them all the same, right? Or Native American, not Indian. And then also he mentions the surplus symbolic value, right? People representing something besides themselves, right? So one Black representation will be depicted for all of Black people, right? You see one Asian character, and that's going to be representative for all of Asian people, right? So this is what the author means by the surplus symbolic value. And then the intersection between power and stereotypes. And they say that the author says that the lack of power institutes these stereotypes taking place, right? Because you don't have the ability to combat these stereotypes. And on the flip side, the people in power have the power to initiate and institutionalize these stereotypes. So understanding the role that power plays in these stereotypes. And then the article or the chapter goes further on to say, to analyze these things, you must do an institutional analysis, right? You cannot do it at an individual level. You must start to begin to analyze the institutions. Also, what I call the neoliberal capture of social movements in media production. And they used films like the Steve Biko film, Cry Freedom, to where the very entity that undermined the apartheid struggle was positioned as the hero, right? So you have the FBI and the CIA who've done very drastic work to undermine the apartheid struggle in South Africa, in the film become the hero of the film, right? So what I call a neoliberal capture of social movements. And then we have a comparative analysis of the Battle of Algiers and then the film Burn. I don't know if you guys seen the film Burn, but what I could do for you guys, I can assign that as an extra credit assignment. I believe it's on YouTube. You've already seen the Battle of Algiers. So if you want to take up this extra credit assignment, watch Burn and then write a one-page comparative essay comparing the Battle of Algiers and the film Burn. Look at how the colonized were projected, right? And that's what you want to kind of compare in your analysis. So again, extra credit assignment, the film Burn is produced by the same producer who made the film Battle of Algiers. To get the full extra credit, you'd have to do a comparative essay, one page, comparing how the colonized are depicted in the film Battle of Algiers, juxtaposed to how the colonized were depicted in the film Burn. And in the article, they say that in the Battle of Algiers, the colonized people were very much a part of the production process, right? They gave the producer insight on how certain scenes should look and things of that nature. So they had a lot more agency in that film. So that's going to help you guys with the comparative analysis. Also, this one drop rule as it pertains to who can play certain roles, right? So the article mentions how, white actors would take blackface to play certain roles, but mulatto actors, mulatto being mixed actresses and actors, would not be able to play white roles, right? So even if they phenotypically could pass as white, that one drop of blackness preventing them from being able to occupy these roles. So this notion of the one drop rule also being adopted and applied in Hollywood. And then, let me go to that. On page 190, you have the triple insults of minority groups, right? And then he breaks it down, A, B, and C. A, you are unworthy of self-representation. B, no one from your community is capable of representing you. And C, we, the producers of film, care little about your offended sensibilities, right? So when we don't even care about how you feel about what we're producing. So the triple threat insult of minority groups. And then this idea of corrective casting, right? So then Hollywood recognized that, we're casting people who are, so think about The Last Samurai played by Tom Cruise, right? Samurais are historically Asian, people of Asian descent. You have Tom Cruise, who was white, playing The Last Samurai, right? So Hollywood seeks to correct this by assigning the appropriate epidermis to the role. So if the character is black, we'll assign a black person. But what the article is critical of, right, those tropes are still at play, right? The way that colonized groups and the way that minoritized groups are captured and depicted as subaltern, as marginalized, are still present, even though you have black people playing black roles, you have indigenous people playing indigenous roles, you have Asian playing Asian roles, it doesn't matter, right? And he uses the example of Clarence Thomas not being able to bring political advancement to black people. So what I would call like a neo-colonial representation, right? And then, I mentioned last week in Googie, but I was confused as to what class read in Googie. So you guys did not read in Googie in this course, but in Googie appears in our reading this week. And how they invoke in Googie is the book that I was thinking about. Is his thesis is, as African writers, we should no longer write in colonial languages. So all of my books going forward after this book will be in my African language, right? So what we read in the article is that premise by Ngugi sparks the minds of African filmmakers. And from that point, you see a lot more African films being produced in African languages with the use of subtitles. So the theoretical work of Ngugi sparks a cultural revolution in the way that African film is being produced, right? Taking and placing value back on your native language. And then they give us 5 Black stereotypes on page 95. The servile Tom, right? The coon, the tragic mulatto, the mammy, the buck. I want to add 2 more stereotypes to that list. The sapphire, the Black woman who is depicted as angry, right? For those who've seen Waiting to Excel, think about Angela Bassett's character in Waiting to Excel as she burns the car, the clothes in the car, right? This is that sapphire character, this angry, upset Black woman, right? Think about a lot of Taraji P. Henderson's roles kind of depict this sapphire modality. The other stereotype that I want to add to this is the Jezebel character, right? The over-sexualized Black woman, right? I'm trying to think about who we could think of in modern times who plays the Jezebel. I can't think of actresses, but I'm more so seeing like hip hop women artists in the play. If you think, your Cardi B's, you think, Megan Thee Stallion. If you think about the content of their songs, kind of situate themselves in this sapphire role. But be attentive to these stereotypes, these 5 or 7 now, right? But also, if we have time, I want you guys, if we have time, I'll put you guys into breakout groups, and I would like for you to assign contemporary individuals to fit each stereotype, right? So who could you think of as the modern day Tom? If you think about Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Who could you think of as a coon in today's society, subdivided into pickaninnies, right? These harmless, eye-popping clown figures. Who could you think of as the tragic mulatto? Who could you think of as playing the role of mammy in today's society? And who could you think of as a buck in today's society? So if we have time, we'll do breakout groups and we'll talk about that. So those are the things that I found of interest in the reading. Again, we could use those things in our fishbowl conversation, or you don't have to. You could decide whatever you feel is interest and talk about that. I'll choose 4 individuals for a fishbowl, and then we'll open it up to a broader classroom conversation where everyone will participate. And then again, if we have time, we'll jump into the breakout groups. If not, we'll call it a day. Does that make sense? Are there any questions, comments, or concerns before we start getting into our fishbowl? Golden?
I just want to know if I could volunteer for today's fish.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to volunteer?
Yeah, I don't mind volunteering too.
Okay, Kenny, Golden. Anyone else? Can I participate? Yes, Jamie. And if we could get one more, we'll be good. So far I have Jamie, Kenny, Golden. We'll have one more. I'll just call randomly. Justine, are you able to fishbowl today? Justine Strange. Remember, you have 1 time to pass. If you do not pass, then you're good to go for the semester. So right now, if Justine, if you could hear me, if you are attentive, you are logged on, are you able to participate in the fishbowl? Okay. Sebastian, have you fishbowled already?
I have, yes.
Okay, thank you, man.
Yeah,
I could volunteer, Professor.
Who said that? I'm sorry.
Me. Luis.
Luis, okay, cool. Luis, have you gone already?
Yeah, I've gone twice.
All right, let's try to get somebody else, man. Just because you quite.
I think somebody volunteered in the chat.
Let me see. Yeah, I had Jaime already in the fishbowl. So we have Jaime, Golden.
I I'd volunteer, but I think I went already.
Yeah, I know you went already. I was trying to give people a chance that haven't gone. Glenda, have you fishbowled already?
Yes, I have
Yeah.
already.
Okay. I know Matthew has. Carla, have you fishbowled?
Yes, I have.
Lilia, have you fishbowled already?
Yes, I have.
Professor,
Yes.
I don't remember fist bowling before.
You don't? Okay, so we'll go with you then, Matthew.
Yeah.
All right, so that will be our 4 for today. We have Matthew, Jaime, Kenny, and Golden. Again, you guys could use some of the points that I've talked about if I found of interest, or just talk about whatever you guys see fit. So the ball is in your court at this point. I'll put myself on mute.
I can start out for the fishbowl. I thought the most interesting points were just that a lot of the stereotypes that are represented in the films have been around since like The Birth of a Nation. Like that was one of the films that they referenced. Like it's been almost a century, and there's still a lot of that going on these days. And those stereotypes that we see in those films, like, have real life consequences as to what people see different groups portrayed as. And I also just wanted to point out that the article actually reminded me of something that I saw a few weeks ago on the news, that the Academy is finally trying to add a diversity requirement to all of the newer films that are coming out for whatever is going to be awarded, which is just like super long overdue. It's been like so long, and they're barely starting to do that right now.
Something that I found really interesting, just to add on, is just the amount of protesting that occurred because of these stereotypes in the films. Because, you know, we always hear the term cancel culture a lot nowadays. And I feel like in my experience, I felt like that was a relatively new idea, that like if something bothered you or something, that you just protested immediately. But I think it seems, I don't know, it's something cool. I feel that even back in the day, or like as long as, let's see, some of these movies like in the 60s or 70s, you know, people were angry back then, just as how angry they are right now. And they showed out by protesting these films, but you don't really hear those protests that often. So it gives you that idea that people were okay with these stereotypes and just naive filmmaking. But, you know, it's a prevalent problem, and, you know, we've been upset about it, or marginalized communities have been upset about it since day one. But I'm glad that we're getting more traction, more awareness about it right now.
I just want to overemphasize the point that you made, Kenny. Like, because they don't play any focus on the protest or the upheavals around these films, as Kenny articulates, right, it gives the impression that people have always been okay with these representations, when in fact that's furthest from the truth. And to Kenny's point, right, people have been protesting and pushing back against these representations since they became on the forefront. And I think, as far as a particular group has done this the best, I would have to say is the Jewish community, right? Anything that remotely rubs the Jewish community the wrong way automatically is anti-Semitism, right? And that, to me, that's an effective way to maintain your representation in a way that you see fit, right? And I think that's something that to pay attention to. It's a very good point, Kenny.
Kind of going off what Kenny was saying, how like this history, like protesting and like people calling out like racism movies for what it is, like being racist and being offensive. I think that it's made a lot of like good strides, because like throughout the whole reading, I just remember the film Roma, because that film specifically for me, because my mom, my grandmother came from Guatemala, but they came as maids, so they worked as maids, they worked as like people who were like in servants, and seeing films that represented that was really powerful, not only for me but for my grandma, who like is so old fashioned, but seeing that movie like brought her to tears because of how realistic and how like it's so, even though it was in Mexico, she still like felt the connection, because it's a story that shows the realism of like immigrants, and not only immigrants but how their life used to be.
What I wanted to bring up, what I really liked about this article is the authors are really focused on nuance, and they weren't just so focused on just saying stereotypes are bad, they went to why and the historical context and everything. And I think that's really lost in a lot of the discussions that we have when we critique movies now. We don't talk about them in nuanced ways. And the specific example I wanted to bring up was earlier this year, there's a movie released on Netflix called Cuties, and there's a lot of outrage over it because a lot of people considered it bait for pedophiles and predators. But I think the film itself was a little bit more complex than the initial trailer and the initial outrage let off. While I do understand the criticism as valid, they failed to talk about how this was the first film of a French woman of Senegalese descent, and she was speaking about her own experience that she felt when she was conflicted with two different cultures, coming from her strict Muslim background and seeing the French culture, and she was trying to portray how young girls feel hypersexualized because that's how she felt. And I feel like it's really frustrating that her career is probably going to be sidetracked because this film that she made, that she tried to talk about a really complex topic, wasn't read in the same way that she wanted to because there's some issues. And yeah, Netflix, the way they framed the trailer made it like they kind of emphasized on the parts where the children were being over sexualized, while in the film it might be a little bit more justified by showing like why this is bad or why you should be uncomfortable. The trailer kind of sensationalized it. And when I was like looking through the critique, I kind of like mentally compared it to Luc Besson's film Beyond the Professional, because that was also a French film based on his own experience, was based on an experience I had dating a 13-year-old, and that film kind of skyrocketed his career to make other films like Lucy and the Fifth Element. But that film was, I don't know, in my mind it was very similar because it's dealing with a young girl being, and sorry, I lost my point. But I just think it's really frustrating that nuance isn't present in more of our critiques of films.
You know, that's a really good point because I even myself, right, I fell a victim to groupthink when it came to Cuties. Like, I'm like, oh, this pedophilia shit, nah, fuck that. I got little girls, I ain't watching that, right? But now hearing what Golden is saying, it kind of makes me take a step back, especially understanding the context of the producer of the film and then her involving her personal experiences to the film. That nuance becomes extremely important. Related, but not directly, right? And I think you see how the media can kind of shift narrative. I think anybody been attentive to Ice Cube over the past couple of days? Can you guys speak on that, Brett?
Vaguely from what I read is that they're saying that he's pro-Trump, but really what it was, he's trying to get both the Democrats and Republicans to try to open up some way where the Black community could get out of poverty and somehow be incorporated into the banking system, whether it be with home loans or small businesses. But it quickly shifted and started calling him out, saying that he's a Trump supporter now.
Yeah, dead on. So what Ice Cube has been doing, I mean, and before he got trending because of this, a lot of his commentary was around Black people voting and Black people being conscious of why they're voting, who they're voting for, and what's gonna come from their vote, right? So me listening to that, and then too, just knowing the history of who Ice Cube is, like not Are We There Yet Ice Cube, but like NWA Ice Cube, right? Like just knowing what Cube is really about. The narrative that they're trying to spin of him being a Trump supporter, it didn't make sense to me, right? And I knew that he was been very critical about how the Black vote should be utilized. So again, upon a nuanced analysis, I uncovered that he first went to meet with the Democrats, right? And the Democrats said, nah, we'll meet with you after the election, right? So then he met with the Republicans, and the Republicans were willing to meet with him in that moment, right? And what he's trying to do is push this idea of a contract with Black America, to Brett's point, to get us some type of economic support to help us climb the economic ladder in the society, right? So by no means is that an endorsement of the Trump campaign, right? But he's playing wise politics, right? There's certain issues that are called bipartisan, right? If you think about how like workers' unions work, don't matter what candidate they're not tied to a party, right? Whatever candidate or whatever party has the best platform and program for them, that's who they're supporting, right? So that's a bipartisan type of political agenda, right? Truckers unions, garbage unions, those are all bipartisan type of agendas. So in Q's mind, this should be no different. It's a false and it's politically unwise to just tie yourself to the Democratic Party because that's the Democratic Party, right? If you look back before, I want to say the Civil War, I could be wrong, but it was switched, right? The Republican Party was a party that was supporting Black causes, right? So again, it's not really about the party, it should be about the policy. And this is what Ice Cube is trying to get us to understand. But the media, council culture, a non-nuanced analysis has Ice Cube portrayed as a Trump supporter, right? So again, it relates, but in a roundabout way, but you do see the role that media could play in shifting the way that we view somebody. Yeah, Tyler, they are currently calling him a sellout, right? And they're using some of his old posts saying that he would never support Trump and saying that he's contradiction now because he's trying to negotiate with Trump. Again, to me, this is a lack of a nuanced analysis. And really, it shows the political immaturity of a lot of voters within this country, right? And I would have to question how effective is a democracy that gives us these two candidates as our best options. But enough of that. So thank you guys for the fishbowl. That went really well. Let's open the conversation up to a broader classroom conversation. I want to hear some other people's thoughts about the reading. Anything in particular that you felt stood out?
One of my questions was when the reading, actually, it's from the very, very first paragraph. And just to summarize, where it says, in which the very last sentence, in which diverse spectators or critics passionately defend their version of real, which led me to think, when it comes to real or realism, how can we as a user accept what we see as real if it's a representation of what someone else thinks?
Yeah.
So.
And that's a very good point, Brett. And to be honest with you, man, that's what got me to my first point of analysis on the reading, is this notion of like, it's not the camera or literature is not capturing the real, it's capturing the ideologies, right? Like these ontological understandings of what we think Black is, what we think Native Americans are, what we think Asian culture is. It's not the real. The real is in the quotidian, in the daily activities of the people who you seek to investigate. You know, I probably should have signed this reading. I actually don't overwhelm you guys. In my film course for my PhD, we read a very interesting article that spoke on how a lot of the origins of film stem from, especially documentaries and ethnographies, they stem from the anthropology field, right? And anybody familiar with the field of anthropology know is very much tied to the white gaze, right? It's dominant culture going into third world spaces, going into the subaltern spaces, and making the real based off of their understanding and their interpretation of culture, right? So to Brett's point, a lot of what we think we know is real is really a anthropological Eurocentric lens or ideology that's been cultivated through this lens that has been packaged to us as a real experience, right? So that's a very, very good point.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think the thing that really got me to my analysis was when what tied me into like the conversation a lot more was on page 179 when it talks about Mississippi burning and how the FBI became the heroes when they were the ones that were basically like sabotaging the movement, not allowing the subaltern voice to be heard. So in that way, and so it like when it said how it makes it seem like the FBI were the ones that were doing everything when it was really when it was really like Black individuals who were involved in the movement themselves, who, you know, so that really stood out. And then also with sorry, it's like it's like a complex reading, but I had another point and I keep losing it. It'll probably come to me, but it kind of brought me back to what I was thinking about last class with Hattie McDaniel too, where she was presented in as like the mammy stereotype, you know, and that was that way for a long time, you know, and it affects the way like people like see individuals, you know. It really like has its effects, and like you don't really realize it until later, you know. But
You know, Tori, you made me think when you mentioned Hattie McDaniels. There was a part in the art and the reading that talks about, and I forget the exact term they use, but to put it in my own words, right? It's like the subversion tactics that the actors and actresses would use, right? And the author talks about how Hattie McDaniels looking into the female protagonist's eyes, right? That's a subtle act of subversion, because in the real world, Blacks weren't allowed to make eye contact with white. When a white person came on the scene, you would be forced to kind of drop your head, right? So it kind of mentions these subtle ways that these actors and actresses are able to subvert the tropes that they are forced to fit into. And I thought that was a really brilliant point, right? Because yeah, it's like nobody wants to, for me, right? Like I'm really big on this currently, this political move of the refusal, right? So I'm a fan of James Baldwin. Also, one of my heroes in the world is Malcolm X, right? So James Baldwin was offered to produce a screenplay for Malcolm X, right? And throughout the production of the screenplay, Baldwin's writing, but then the studio who's going to produce the screenplay starts assigning him writer's aides, right? So we're going to just kind of send a writing aide to help you out, make this a little bit more polished for the silver screen, et cetera, et cetera. But what Baldwin noticed, a lot of the spirit of his writing would get distracted, right? And he got this really watered down version of the screenplay. So what Baldwin did was like, you know what, fuck this, give me my screenplay, and I'm not gonna do it. I refuse to participate, right? So this is the ideal of a refusal, right? I'm in a seminar on Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist. We read a little bit of Frantz Fanon, right? But he left his role as a psychiatrist for the Colonial Hospital because he felt it was a contradiction, right? Like, I'm actively participating in the FLN, the Freedom Liberation Nationale for the Algerian people, but at the same time, I'm working for the hospital that is a colonial empire, right? And I need to settle this contradiction, so I'm going to refuse to work for the hospital anymore. So this notion of refusal, right? The Pan-African Studies Department on campus, they're currently in a state of refusal, right? Because of some politics in the way that the new College of Ethnic Studies is being conducted, the way that they're going about searching for their dean. We felt that it's very anti-Black in its essence, right? So the Department of Pan-African Studies is refusing to participate in any campus activities, right? We'll do our own separate things, but being as part of the overall college campus, we refuse to participate because of its overwhelming anti-Black sentiment, right? So this notion or this idea of refusal as a political strategy is something that I'm kind of interested in at the moment. But you think about the Stephen Feshins, you think about the Hattie McDaniels, right? And a part of me says, fuck that, refuse. Refusal is the way to go. Refuse that pick-a-mimmy stereotype playing that role, right? But what's brilliant was their ability not to refuse, to take it because they understand the importance of exposure, right? And this is where that double consciousness comes into play, because although we're viewing this tropish, substandard depiction of ourselves, it does something to see ourselves on the TV screen, right? It gives us a place in the world to even see ourselves depicted, even though it's a subpar representation, right? So this is where this double consciousness comes into play. But within that, they're subverting these tropes, right? Hattie McDaniel's looking her in the eye, things of that nature. So it's just a really profound, and back to Golden's point, a really nuanced analysis of how all these things intersect. Go ahead, Tori.
Yeah, so like, yeah, because I was thinking about what you're saying. It's kind of like she's not, instead of refusing the role, she's claiming that role because that representation is important. So in that sense, it is like a moment of refusal because she's refusing to not be seen.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, people also take away the fact too that I like, it hurts my heart that like she was like the first Black woman to get an Oscar, and she wasn't even allowed to like sit in the room, and like even go to the premiere. But I mean, it like, yeah. Sorry, I go on these tangents.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and I also, sorry, just before I forget, the other point I wanted to make too was that the kind of like, I think on page 183, when it talks about how when like there's a white like when maybe there's a white person in office, they won't think of every white person as bad, but like if it's the subaltern voice, they're gonna be like, oh, like they use that stereotype and they grab onto it. So it's just kind of made me think of how media uses sort of like the white image to revert attention from things in order to make it it's a tool of domination, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then too, I think also implicitly in there is that Baldwinian notion of white innocence, right? So whereas one white person makes a mistake, that's one bad apple, right? That's one bad cop. It's not all of cops, right? But a Black person does Black on Black crime, right? You know what I mean? So the Mexican Contras, right? It's a universal idea when it's marginalized groups, but you have the ability to act as an individual when you're part of that dominant culture. So that's a very good point. Other thoughts on the reading?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead. Tyler, then Louise.
Oh, my fault. No, he go ahead first if you want to. It's cool.
It don't matter. I was like, it don't matter.
All right, then I guess I'll just say what I said. From the reading, I don't know if anyone said anything on it. I probably missed it, but I mean, I kind of seen this one coming, but there was one part in the reading that talked about Spike Lee talking about like the glass ceiling and how like most Black like filmmakers are like they're on a restriction, and like when it comes to sums of money and how they're able to use a certain amount of money. And he just talks about that stems back to the stereotypical saying is like Black people don't know how to manage their money and like take care of their funds and stuff like that. So that was kind of something I found was like, all right, well, that definitely something that I've heard before, and that's just right there itself is just crazy to me. And also I was reading how the NAACP, they were trying to when you were talking about how these stories are made and how their narrative they use to like portray communities and stuff like that. And I was just going back to the NAACP trying to get more Black, screenwriters and filmmakers and stuff. Cause, everyone that's like comes from like our culture, the whole thing is like, clout and fame and being in front of the camera and being big time in like Hollywood. And I mean, that's not really like my whole thing. My more thing is about just like making dope shit, like, making cool stuff and making a good story. And I think that's what we need in order to change the whole narrative of how these stories are told. We have to get more people of color in those like storyboard rooms and those screenwriting rooms. We have to. It's the only way, because I mean, they're the ones controlling really the story. Obviously goes into, production and it goes from there, but pre-production is a huge part, and there's not enough people of like color in those departments that I feel like that are, I mean, it's changing now, but it can only improve how I feel. And yeah, that's really what I took from it. And I don't know. Yeah, that's all I really got. I mean, also, no. That's all I got. That's all I got.
So, a couple of things in regards to Tyler's statements. One, thinking about that glass ceiling and the funding as it pertains to Spike Lee. When I was reading that, I thought about his film Malcolm X, right? Probably my favorite movie of all time. But how he went about for getting the money for that, right? So Michael Jordan was a financial provider for that. Magic Johnson was a financial provider for that. Arsenio Hall, I believe, was a financial provider for that. So when the budget ran out, Oprah, thank you, Tyler. When the budget ran out, he went to, these famous Black wealthy individuals to help support the budget for the remainder of the movie. So I believe, one, they wanted the film to be 2 hours. He ended up pushing it to be 3. Two, another part for Spike that was imperative was Malcolm's Hajj, his trip to Mecca, right? And the studios didn't want to fund that. And that's where a lot of the money from, the Michael Jordans, the Oprahs, et cetera, came from, allowed him to kind of make that trip abroad and produce the parts of the film where he is traveling in Mecca. So that, that's something also I was attentive to, Tyler. And then also what you're saying about far as the writing room and the producers and things of that nature, that made me think about Issa Rae and her show Insecure, which started out as a web series, Awkward Black Girl, that was developed into this HBO phenomenon, Insecure. But there was like a 2 to 3 year window before the show got picked up and the time that it was able to go into production, where she was in a battle to decide who was going to be in her writing room, right? And she wanted to have an all-Black writing cast. And that was something that was very important to her, to the point that the production of the show was prolonged 2 to 3 years because she wanted to ensure that she had that writing cast. And I think if for those who watch the show, those who are familiar with like Black LA culture, it is to me the personification of Black LA culture. Like somebody who lived in Inglewood and the places that she visits, right? Like the way she's able to produce that depiction is spot on. And I think that's only because of those who she had in her writing room. Luis, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, it was just kind of in ties with pretty much what everyone in the class has been saying, but there was a part on, I believe on 180, where like it gives talks about how Hollywood depicts how every culture looks, and it brought me back to 2 movies actually that I seen, Apocalypto and Even in the Rain, or Even the Rain, something like that, where it's like this perception of an Americanized society that goes, like the Eurocentrism, that they go to another country and they try to make it seem through the camera as how they see it, not how the people there, the indigenous people there are living. They don't ask how they feel. They don't ask what's going on with them, like what they need or anything like that. It's more like, okay, this is what we see and they're struggling, and that's it. They never really ask or get any permission or actually try to dive into their culture and get to know their daily struggles. Is more about like, oh, these guys are suffering and that's it, there's nothing we can do. But yet through the camera they try to tell this story that, oh yeah, they're living in hard times, but they're not as bad as ours, which is, to me, it's ludicrous that to even show that and to even think that way. You would think like we're trying to bring realism, but that's not real at all. That's, if anything, that's all fake. None of it is real.
And Luis, so do you think Apocalypto did a good job of representing the culture it was trying to depict?
No, hell no. Because my great grandmother, her mom is actually from that indigenous side, which is Aztec, and her father was Mayan descent. So it kind of like, some of the stuff that Mel Gibson, I guess, he was using, he just kind of ripped off of other indigenous cultures. It never really was a full depiction of what actually went on during those ages. And I mean, like, I wish they could have done a little bit better, But, like, again, he does have the money. He is of white privilege. So it's what he wants to show, his vision, not the vision of the people. So that's where it kind of, to me, it didn't make sense. And it was disrespectful in a way.
Yeah. And that's to me where the article talks about, you can't expect Clarence Thomas to be politically advocating for Black people, although he's Black, right? And I think that's where you kind of see, although Mel Gibson used the indigenous people to be in the film, right? There's still tropish depictions of those people and those experiences. It was a very good point. Let's get a couple more thoughts about the reading before we do our breakout groups and call it a day.
I want to talk about well, it's like a little part in the reading how and associated with, like, we talk about modern colonization and like how filmmakers want to make their movies so real. In this case, like Francis Ford Coppola with Apocalypse Now, and he goes to it's like the Vietnam War, so they go to the Philippines to shoot because so cheap, and they explode like the locals for cheap labor. And I think Roy Corman and like a lot of filmmakers were like going to like the Philippines because they were like, okay, like we have the jungle here, we can shoot like a jungle movie, but it's so cheap. So it's like in Hollywood trying to colonize, in a different way other countries and just showing up. And
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And I think they kind of liken that in the article to companies trying to go get cheap labor, right? Like it's just a different form of exploitation. And you see these capitalist practices play out in the film industry. A very good point. One more comment before we jump into breakout groups.
I kind of wanted to add something about stereotypes and representation in films. So I think somewhere in the reading when they were talking about casting, or like the before the casting, they were saying like not only like the inaccurate representation or stereotypes comes from like Eurocentric production in Hollywood, like wants to keep like the idea of Eurocentrism and like wanting a power or like wanting to feel superiority over like some people, but also like these stereotypes and representation comes from Eurocentric audience in Hollywood. Like they also talk about like how Hollywood production tends to focus on dominant group in the US because like the Eurocentric audience is their target audience, and then they're the one who make money for them. So I found it interesting how like to solve this like stereotype, like this issue with stereotypes and inaccurate representation, you also have to think about like how the audience should be, or like how I just found interesting how like it also relates to economic purpose, like how Hollywood films prioritize the economic value than accurate representation of certain group of people.
That's a really good point, Lilia. And then too, because where that really comes into play is like the justification is no one will buy a film with an accurate representation of indigenous people, right? So we got to kind of Hollywood it up to make the film presentable to those who want to view it. And that's how they use the economic gain to justify their troping of these groups, right? And then also when I was reading on page 193, Lily, it made me think of you also, how you were mentioning, I believe last week, as it pertains to language, how, people in Asian cultures are willing to be bilingual, right? But United States culture isn't willing to learn the Asian languages when they travel there. And you see this play out in the reading on page 193 in the French film Black Girl, or I forgot what it's called in French, Noir something, Noir des Girls or something like that. But it's a French film based on a Senegalese protagonist who I believe she's picked up from Senegal and brought to French to France, excuse me. But in the film, right, she's bilingual. She can speak her Senegalese language and she speaks French. But the way that she's treated because of this is as if she's a caricature, a mascot almost, right? She is not, doesn't speak to her intelligence that she could carry both languages. It just further tropes her or otherizes her in her ability to speak dual languages. So let's do this. We'll break out into breakout groups, about 5-10 minutes. I want to kind of discuss these stereotypes, the 5 stereotypes that were provided. I'm going to read through them again to kind of give you guys a artistic depiction of them. But what I want you guys to do is kind of think about who in today's society fits these roles, right? So the servile Tom, and all they give us is going back to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So think of individuals from a political standpoint, from a social standpoint, who are always willing to take the oppressor's position, right? Even though they occupy the body of an oppressed people, right? So they may be Black, but they're always seeming to take the position of the dominant culture, right? For me, if I could think about this in a sports context, I would have to say Stephen A. Smith, right? It'll come down to a conversation, he's always gonna toe the company line, right? So this is what we think about when we say this Tom figure. Hence the terminology Uncle Tom, right? So if anybody in the Black community we feel is selling out, the first thing we're gonna call you is Uncle Tom. So think about our modern day Uncle Toms, right? The coon. Steppenfetchen is the archetypal example. A type is subdivided into the pickaninny, the harmless eye-popping clown figure, and the Uncle Remus, naive, congenial folk philosopher. So for those who think of, those who've ever seen Boondocks, right, think of Uncle Ruckus. That's that character there, that coon character. The character who's willing to make a fool of himself to support the superiority of whiteness or to make white folks feel comfortable, right? So think about that individual in the modern day context. The tragic mulatto, typically a mixed character, right? But there's always some tragedy she's involved in due to the fact of her being in mixed origin, right? She can never fit in one world, so she's always in some type of tragedy, right? So who could we think fills that role in our society today? The mammy, Hattie McDaniels, right? The fat, cantankerous, but ultimately sympathetic female servant who provides the glue that keeps households together. The Aunt Jemima handkerchief head is one variant, such as Hattie McDaniels in Gone with the Wind. I think about just the movie as a whole, The Help, right? That's a trope of this stereotype. And then the buck, the brutal, hypersexualized Black man, a figure of mince inherited from the stage, whose famous filmic incarnation is perhaps Gus in Birth of a Nation, in which George Bush reconstructed it for the electoral purposes with Willie Horton, right? Willie Horton is this figure in the 80s that I believe was falsely accused of raping a white woman, and George Bush props this individual and the circumstances on the scene of his election platform to initiate this idea of super predators, which comes later on, to initiate this idea that we need to be tough on crime and the war on drugs, right? So this is that Black, is this buck character. Think about O-Dog from Men's to Society for those who've seen that movie, right? Okay, and then if you want to, we also have the Jezebel character, right? The hypersexualized woman, so which is the sexual counterpart to the buck. And then we have the Sapphire, which is the angry Black woman. Again, I gave the example of Angela Bassett in Waiting to Excel. So I'm gonna put you guys in groups. You'll have about 5 to 7 minutes to discuss that. And then we'll come back, have a classroom conversation about these stereotypes, and we'll call it a day. It'll be about 5 to each group. Please assign a spokesperson, so that way when we come back, we can just kind of run into the conversation. Is there any questions about the assignment or the tasks we have for the breakout groups? Where do we find the stereotype? The actual terms are on your reading on page 195 towards the middle of the page. They have those stereotypes there. So if you need that. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna set you guys into the breakout groups. Hey, Josh, man, perfect. Thank you. Start the recording back. Got about 4 people coming in. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started while they file in. Again, I don't know who's the assigned spokesperson, but for group 1, it's Leonardo's group. So if you're in Leonardo's group and they assign you the spokesperson. For group 2, it's Drew's group. So if you're in Drew's group and they assigned you the spokesperson. For group 3, it was Joshua's group. So if you were in his group and you've been assigned the spokesperson. For group 4, it's Pablo's group. So if you were in Pablo's group and you were being assigned the spokesperson, that would be on you. And then group 5 would be Angel's group. So if you were in Angel's group and you have been assigned the spokesperson, it would be on you. We'll start with group 5. So whoever was in Angel's group and whoever was assigned to be the spokesperson is on you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll speak. First, it was kind of hard to really pinpoint who people are in these categories because then again, there's stereotypes of what people think the reality is. So we narrowed it down to movies. Definitely for Uncle Tom, Samuel L. Jackson, and Django. We came up with, and of course, the coon, Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks. The tragic mulatto, Stacey Dash. You know how she kind of aligned herself with the Republican Party. Mammy, the closest thing is Octavia Spencer in The Help. For a buck would be pretty much any rap artist, and Terry Crews in White Chicks. And the Sapphire role, the mom from Everybody Hates Chris is being angry. And the Jezebel, of course, Cardi B. I mean, that's a given. So those are the ones that we came up with.
So good job. So we'll go next with group 4, which was Pablo's group. So whoever's the spokesperson for group 4.
I think I'll go. We didn't do the Sapphire and Jezebel, but we actually had a really similar list. For Uncle Tom, though, we had Kanye West. Oh, we also did a mix of characters in films and movies and just people's public image. But for Uncle Tom, we did Kanye West. For Coon, we did Kevin Hart in various film roles he's had. For Tragic Mulatto, we also did Stacey Dash. For the Mammy, we did Octavia Spencer in different roles she's had. And for the Buck, we also did Terry Crews.
You know, I wish I knew Terry Crews would make the list, but I'm surprised as the Buck. That's just so to me.
Tyler also said that we should do Terry Crews as Coon, but we ended up leaving him for Buck.
I mean, shit, Terry Crews could be Tom, Buck. I mean, any other black stereotypical role. He could be all them motherfuckers. We could just put Terry Crews' picture in the dictionary for all of them. But let's see group 3, which was Joshua's group.
Yeah, I'm the spokesperson. So some of our categories are kind of similar to others. Like, yeah, Terry Crews, the Buck. We put Samuel Jackson's character in Django Chained as the Coon, and we were just having trouble trying to find the tragic mulatto and what else. Because I want to get to the first category. I think that's the most important. Let's see.
We did Candace Owens for the first one.
Yeah, in terms of like in a political sphere, like she makes like a pretty good example of upholding the oppressor, like changing the narrative, like systemic racism doesn't exist, like putting down the victims of police brutality, and just like diverting the conversation away from race, like, you know, the ultimate grifter.
Perfect. That's that's a really good one. I have another one in mind, but I'm gonna see how group 2 does before I throw that out. So group 2 was Drew's group. Who do you guys have for the spokesperson?
I think it was me. So we had a very complicated time. We couldn't. We were like, because the time crunch. We're like, we had to find, but it was hard. So I think we kind of brought up like how maybe we haven't like paid attention as much to these stereotypes, and that's why it may have been hard for us. But one that we did mention was like Terry Crews as the Buck as well. But the point that I wanted to kind of make about that is that like like he's been like hypersexualized, he still is, of course, but like in some shows he's kind of been reverting that, like changing the narrative for that stereotype in a way, like in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He's like this like soft, he has like this soft personality. He's like I love my kids, you know. And so he's not like angry, and so yes, he's still like this buff guy, but like it's kind of changed that toxic masculinity as well, you know, within that stereotype. But it was hard for us to cut. We were like, oh, so yeah, we kind of figured, you know, we should probably pay attention more to these stereotypes.
And that's cool too, right? Just to kind of get your mind thinking about it is really what the project was. So that works. And last, certainly not least, I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone else say something.
Real quick, I was in that group too. Since we're doing like actual people for the Uncle Tom, was Herschel Walker kind of recently.
Woo, yeah.
So yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good one. Shit, historically, Jackie Robinson, if y'all don't know, look up his history and his role in politics. He also played that role as well. That's a good point. So last group was Leonardo's group. So who was the spokesperson for that group?
Oh, I am. We didn't get through the whole categories, but we had Kanye West, like other group was saying, for Tom. Mm-hmm. And then it's not recent, but I think for Mami we have the lady from A Birth of a Nation, and also someone from our group was saying her friend, so asked her Kanye's name on the ballot, so that was interesting.
Somebody said their friend, like somebody they actually know, like their friend. So Lily, you said, I just want to make sure I'm understanding right. You said somebody in your group mentioned that their friend was one of the sellouts?
Their friend saw Kanye's name on the ballot.
Oh, okay, got you. Okay, okay. All right, bet. That's all you guys had so far, Lillian?
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So for me, again, in the sports world, ESPN Sage Steele, she always plays that tragic mulatto, also the Tom role, right? She always takes the side of the oppressor. Jason Whitlock, absolutely, quintessential depiction. You know who has evolved, right, in his role of Tom, to me, is Don Lemon. Like, historically, he was always Tommen, right? But if you kind of listen, like, Trump then drove Don Lemon woke. Like, Trump's foolishness has been so bad that Don Lemon now has a sense of political consciousness. So that's somebody who's kind of evolved on that spectrum. But what I will say, I think the biggest takeaway from your guys' work was realizing the meta method, in the sense that these are all depictions, right? We don't know these people, so we cannot say who they are and how they fit. So we're going to either take a character from a film or how we understand their media personality to be, right? And I think that is more of a bigger takeaway than putting people in the categories, because that is what the reading was trying to get us to see. We don't know what's real. Like, what's coming through this, we don't know what's real or not. All this shit could be altered, right? So at best, it's a representation of an ideology of a given society. And that's the way that we have to interpret what the real is as it pertains to media, based on what the reading argues. So we'll end it there. Next week, there's no readings being assigned. Just kind of recap what we did leading up to this point. We'll do a midterm review on Friday. What I'll do either that Saturday, sometime between Saturday, that following Saturday, and that Monday, I'll post the midterm on our Google Classroom site, and I'll also email that to you. And you guys have to have those midterms submitted back to me before 12 o'clock next Friday. So just kind of give you guys some dates so we're on the same page.
And the journal.
And the journals, yes. So the 23rd of October, we'll do our midterm review. Either the 24th or the 26th, I'll post the midterm on Google Classroom, and I'll email it to you. So I'll do both. And then you have to submit the midterm back to me by the 30th before 12 o'clock. So anytime before, so you can email them to me. You can either email them to me along with their journals or post them on the Google Classroom doc. So when they're posted as an assignment, you can submit the assignment on Google Classroom, and it lets me know that you've done it. And then I'll also include the grade 12 noon, so before our class, so before class starts. What I will do also, as I get through them and I get them graded, I'll post the grades for them on Google Classroom, so that way you know what your grades are. I don't think you guys will have a problem. Just from the conversation that we have in class, everybody should be fine. The only thing I think would trip you guys up, if anything, make sure you use a theoretical framework, and we'll discuss that on our midterm review in more detail. And then also make sure you read the questions carefully, because typically they're like 2 questions in one. So as long as you're doing those 2 things, you guys should be absolutely fine. I don't think the material itself will be a problem for you guys. Is there any questions, comments, or concerns for me? You have until the start of class, Tori. So the 30th by like 11:59 a.m. Okay, cool. Cool. Other than that, just email me. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And again, remember, you do have the extra credit assignment. Watch the film Burn. Do a comparative analysis essay, 1 page, on the difference on the way that the colonial people were portrayed in Burn and Battle of Algiers. Just whenever you get it to me, I'm not tripping. As long as you get it before I can submit the grades. So, all right, guys. Other than that, you guys have a good, safe week and weekend. I'll see you next week. Peace.
Thank you. You as well.
Have a good day.
Hey, Professor, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I'm one of the people that hasn't done a fishbowl yet.
Okay.
But I didn't volunteer because I couldn't find this week's reading.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No worries. So just off jump, all the readings are always going to be available on Google Classroom under the course.
Yeah. I haven't had any trouble finding any of the other ones. I mean, like last week's. So for me, in my opinion, from my view, like you have last week's reading, week 7, and then there's just a gap, and the next one I could see is week 10.
You know what? Because I think for the unpacking Eurocentrism, it's all under one block, right? Let me see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So,
yeah, so it was under Unthinking Euro.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see it now.
And then
sorry about that.
So don't worry about it. As long as I got you, Tyler. As long as you got the information that we discussed, you should be okay. But if you really want, you can always go back and read it. But we're not going to be pulling from this book anymore going forward throughout the semester.
Okay. No. Yeah. I'll read it, and then I'll do my journal and as well.
Do the journal.
Yeah. I just sorry for the late notice. I usually don't read it until this morning, or yesterday,
Yeah,
so I didn't want to email you and tell you I couldn't find it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if anything, just let me know so that way I can help get you situated, and then I'm just in the loop. So don't feel like I'm gonna knock points or nothing like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome, man. Leonardo, did you have a question?